At first glance, it was just another ordinary day at the beach, but the elderly fisherman had no idea that his discovery would turn everything upside down. A massive rusty chain was sticking out of the sand, and he decided to pull it, unaware that at the other end was something that would shock all who witnessed it. Subscribe and write in the comments. Where are you watching this video from? The morning after the storm carried with it an uneasy stillness, the kind of silence that comes only when the sea has spent the night thrashing against the world and now pauses to catch its breath. The town of Port Ivy, a weather-worn settlement pressed against the southern edge of South Carolina's coast, woke slowly. The streets were still littered with palm fronds and branches stripped by the wind. Boats sat at crooked angles along the narrow harbor, ropes frayed and tarps flapping with a tired snap in the breeze. The houses nearest the shore bore streaks of salt along their shutters, pale reminders that the ocean had reached for them again, testing the patience of those who had chosen to live so close to its volatile heart. Sitting alone in his small clapboard house by the edge of the dunes, Samuel Hill tied the straps of his old rubber boots. He moved slowly, not because of hesitation, but because years at sea had carved patience into his bones. At 68, his body was less forgiving than it once had been, but his hands remained steady, his shoulders square, and his mind as sharp as the salt wind. He had woken before dawn, as he always did, driven by the habits of a lifetime spent in the service of the sea. His nets had been out the night before, anchored in calmer water, and he wanted to see whether the storm had been merciful enough to spare them. As he stepped onto the beach, he squinted at the horizon where the sky still carried bruised shades of violet and gray. The air smelled heavy, rich with iodine and seaweed, as if the ocean had exhaled during the storm and left its breath lingering over the land. Waves crashed with a residual strength, not violent now, but still powerful, rolling against the shore with a rhythm that made the sand hum beneath his boots. To Samuel, the sound was familiar, comforting even, though it carried an undertone that set his instincts on edge. The sea never sounded the same twice, and today there was a strain in its voice. He made his way along the wet sand, his shadow stretching long and crooked under the slant of the early sun. The nets, if they had survived, would be further down the beach. But before he reached them, something unusual caught his eye. At first, it was no more than a shape half buried in the shifting sand, indistinguishable from the detritus storms so often spat up onto the shore. Yet something about the way the morning light glanced off it made him slow his steps. As he drew closer, he realized it was metal. A large curved form, mottled with rust and encrusted with barnacles, jutted from the sand at a strange angle. It took him a moment to understand what he was looking at. A chain. Not the sort of chain used to tie down boats in the harbor, nor the kind that held the buoys steady out on the shoals. This one was massive, each link thick enough to swallow both his fists, forged from a kind of iron he had not seen in decades. The storm must have unearthed it from its sandy grave. It lay in a slow curve across the beach, half lost beneath the surf, stretching toward the sea as if tethering some vast creature that waited just beyond the reach of the waves. He stood still, boots sinking slightly into the wet sand, staring down at the chain with a mixture of suspicion and awe. Chains were not unusual along the coast. Remnants of wrecks often turned up, but this one felt different. There was something deliberate about its presence, something that made his pulse quicken against his ribs. He crouched, ignoring the ache in his knees, and brushed the surface of one of the links. The metal was rough under his calloused palm, coated with years of salt and decay, but beneath the grime he could still feel the strength of the forge. It hadn't been broken or twisted. It was whole, complete, as though it had been waiting for someone to notice. The waves surged forward, lapping around his boots and over the buried portion of the chain. The sound it made, the groan of iron under pressure, stirred an old memory from deep within him. It reminded him of nights aboard a destroyer during his youth in the Navy, when the anchors groaned against their moorings in heavy seas. There had been nights when he felt the ocean pulling at the ship with all its fury, and he knew how fragile even the strongest steel could be. That same feeling, half fear and half reverence, settled over him now. He rose slowly, his gaze following the direction of the chain. It vanished into the water, swallowed by the restless tide, and for a long moment he imagined what might lie at the other end. Perhaps the wreckage of some old warship, forgotten and buried by decades of storms and shifting sands. Perhaps a lost freighter, heavy with cargo. Or perhaps something stranger, something the sea had hidden, not out of indifference but by choice. Samuel had lived long enough to know the ocean did not always give back what it claimed, and when it did, it was never without purpose. He glanced around, half expecting to see others noticing the discovery. But the beach was empty. The town was still slow to wake, its people tucked in their houses or cleaning up after the storm. For now it was his alone, a secret placed at his feet. He bent once more and wrapped his thick fingers around the chain. It was cold, biting even through the calluses and heavier than he imagined. He gave it a tentative tug. The sound startled him. The links shifted with a deep, hollow clang, reverberating in the still air. It was not the sound of dead iron, but of something alive, resonant, as though the ocean itself had answered back. He released it at once, the echo rolling through him long after the metal stilled. He swallowed hard, aware of his own heartbeat drumming in his ears. For a moment he thought of walking away, of letting the tide bury it once more. His father had warned him often when he was a boy. Don't take from the sea what it isn't ready to give. The ocean kept its own counsel, and meddling with it could bring trouble. But something deeper, something older than caution, began to stir in Samuel's chest. He had spent his whole life beside the sea, listening to it, watching it change, losing to it the people he loved most. And now here was a mystery only he had found. It felt less like coincidence and more like invitation. The sky shifted above him. Thin clouds began to pull together, drawn across the blue like strands of gray cloth. A wind moved inland from the horizon, carrying a chill with it, and the hairs along the back of his neck lifted. The storm was supposed to be over, yet here was the sea preparing again, restless and unwilling to be still. He narrowed his eyes at the chain, realizing with a certainty he couldn't explain that he had stumbled upon something meant to be uncovered. He turned his back on the water for the moment and continued toward his nets, though his thoughts no longer lingered on the fish or the harvest. They circled around the chain, around the way it had hummed when he pulled it, around the sense that the ocean had revealed a secret meant for him alone. His boots dragged slightly through the sand, his shoulders heavy, as though he already carried the weight of whatever waited at the other end of that iron tether. By the time he reached the nets, tangled and battered but intact, the decision had already been made within him. He would come back. He would dig, pull, wrestle if he had to. He would not leave that chain to vanish beneath the tide again. The sea had shown him something, and he would answer. For the first time in many years, Samuel felt something ignite within him, something sharp and alive. It was not hope, not exactly, but a hunger for truth, for discovery, for whatever the ocean had decided to reveal at last. And as he gathered his nets under the gathering sky, he knew there would be no turning back. The thought of the chain stayed with Samuel through the rest of the morning and into the afternoon. He tried to busy himself with the ordinary tasks of his day, mending the torn edges of his nets, checking the small engine on his boat, hauling what little catch had survived the storm. but nothing could untangle his mind from the image of those rusted links vanishing into the sea. Every clang of his tools, every groan of wood beneath his boots seemed to remind him of that iron weight hidden in the sand. He told himself to leave it alone, that he had already lived too long to be chasing mysteries that belonged to younger men. Yet the pull of it was constant, steady as the tide. By the time the sun had swung low and cast a dull orange haze across the waves, he knew he would return. The following morning, he set out earlier than usual. The beach was quieter still, the remnants of the storm smoothed away, though the sky carried a strange heaviness that suggested the sea was not finished with its moods. He brought with him a length of rope and an old hand-crank winch he had kept since his Navy days. It was rusted but still functional, a relic of an era when he trusted no storm and always prepared for the worst. He trudged across the sand, feeling the cold iron of the winch pressing against his shoulder, and when he reached the spot where the chain lay, the sight of it sent a sharp thrill through his chest. It had not moved, half buried once more by the restless tide, but undeniably there, waiting. Samuel set the winch into the sand and looped his rope through one of the massive links. The steel scraped with a noise that made the hairs on his arms rise. Then, bracing himself, he began to crank. The winch groaned in protest, the rope stretching taut, the chain shuddering beneath the pressure. For a long moment nothing happened, and he thought perhaps he had been foolish to think his strength, or even the strength of the winch, could coax anything from the grip of the ocean. But then the iron shifted. A deep, reluctant rumble passed through the links, and the sand around them sank and slid aside. He felt the tremor through his boots, through his arms, deep into his chest. It was not simply the movement of metal against earth. It was something heavier, something vast. He paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, though the morning was cool. His breath came slow but steady. He knew he could not stop now. It was at this moment that voices drifted to him across the beach. A pair of joggers had slowed their pace, curiosity pulling them toward the sight of an old man wrestling with something half buried in the sand. One of them called out a question, but Samuel only grunted, unwilling to break his concentration. The joggers exchanged looks and moved closer. Before long, one of them stepped forward, laughing nervously, and offered to lend a hand. Samuel gave a curt nod, and together they pulled. The chain yielded another length, groaning as it surfaced, speckled with seaweed and the stubborn grip of barnacles. More passers-by appeared. A family out walking their dogs stopped to stare, the children whispering excitedly, the father squinting with interest. Teenagers arrived soon after, their phones raised to capture the spectacle. What began as a solitary act of obsession was now a strange gathering, an unplanned audience drawn by the weight of mystery. Samuel, though not one for attention, did not mind. The chain was no longer just his burden to tug against. It had become a shared curiosity, a thing that demanded witnesses. The more they pulled, the more the chain seemed to resist. With each length uncovered, the sound deepened. It was not just the grind of rust and sand. It was something resonant, hollow, as though each tug plucked the string of a great instrument beneath the earth. The sound carried over the waves, echoing back from the water with uncanny clarity. Some of the onlookers shifted uneasily, whispering about how strange it sounded, but none left. If anything, the unease made them stay longer, drawn in by the strangeness of it all. Samuel worked silently, though inside him old memories stirred like restless ghosts. He thought of his father, who had once spoken of places along the coast where ships disappeared without trace, swallowed whole by waters that offered no explanation. Locals called it the Silent Graveyard, a stretch of ocean where compasses spun and nets returned empty, where men swore they heard voices rising from the deep. Samuel had dismissed it as superstition when he was younger, but standing now with his hand clenched tight around this impossible chain, He wondered if the old stories had been rooted in truth. The sky began to shift again, the sunlight dimming behind a veil of clouds. The wind pushed harder across the sand, tossing grit into the eyes of the bystanders. A few muttered about leaving, but the sight of Samuel, stubborn and unyielding, pulling with a kind of reverence, made them hesitate. He seemed less a fisherman and more a figure from some older story, a man chosen by fate to uncover whatever lay hidden beneath the tide. Then, with one final surge of effort from those who dared to join him, the chain gave way enough to reveal a shape beneath the sand. At first it seemed like another link, larger than the rest, but as they scraped the surface clear, it became obvious that it was part of something greater. The sand sloughed off in sheets, exposing the edge of a structure metal, riveted, too precise to be natural. A murmur rose among the crowd, sharp with excitement and fear. It looked like a door. Samuel dropped to his knees, brushing the sand away with his weathered hands. The surface was corroded, scarred with time, but he recognized the outline of reinforced plating. This was no anchor, no simple wreck. It was the skin of a vessel buried long ago and reluctant to resurface. He felt the weight of its history pressing on him, pressing on them all. Whatever lay beneath had not wanted to be found. The joggers and the teenagers stood back now, their initial amusement replaced by awe. The family shepherded their children closer, hushed and wide-eyed. More people had gathered at the edges of the beach, drawn by the rumor that spread faster than the tide. A fisherman with salt in his beard muttered that it had to be an old cargo ship, sunk and forgotten. Another swore it was military. None of them knew for certain, but all of them agreed on one thing. They had never seen anything like it. Samuel sat back on his heels, chest heaving, eyes locked on the emerging shape. He did not speak, for words would have only cheapened the enormity of the moment. He felt the old warnings of his father stirring again, that the sea did not give up its secrets freely. But it was too late now. The chain had been drawn, the first piece revealed, and he knew there would be no stopping what came next. The wind surged, rattling through the grass along the dunes. The ocean rose higher, as if it too strained against the pull of the chain. A tremor ran through the ground, subtle but undeniable, and the iron beneath them seemed almost to breathe. Some in the crowd stepped back, whispering about whether they should leave, whether they had awakened something best left to the deep. Samuel did not move. He kept his eyes on the rusting steel, on the shape that promised answers. Fear had no place in him now. He had spent his whole life listening to the ocean, and in this moment he was certain of only one thing. Whatever waited at the end of that chain had chosen to reveal itself, and he was meant to see it through. The crowd fell into uneasy silence, and the sound of the waves grew louder, filling the space between them with a low, endless roar. The sky had darkened to the color of pewter, the air heavy and electric. Samuel rose, gripping the chain once more, and in the stillness before the storm he felt it move under his hand, not pulled by them, but tugging back, as though something vast beneath the surface had begun to stir. The day was not over, and the sea was not finished. By the time the strange groan of the chain and the glimpse of steel beneath the sand settled into the minds of those who had witnessed it, the news had already begun to spill beyond the beach. What started as murmurs among joggers and curious families turned into hurried whispers carried back into town. In a place as small as Port Ivy, word traveled fast, and by the following morning, the chain was no longer the curiosity of a few, but the obsession of many. The beach that had once been nearly empty in the quiet after the storm now bustled with life. Footprints scarred the sand where waves had smoothed it. Cars crowded the nearest lot, and groups of strangers leaned forward on tiptoe as if their closeness to the chain might reveal more of its secrets. Samuel Hill was there before all of them. He had risen with the first touch of dawn, his body stiff with fatigue from the previous day's efforts, but his will unbroken. The image of the half-buried hatch had burned itself into his thoughts during the long, restless night. He had not slept so much as drifted, dreaming of riveted steel and echoing groans from the deep. Now, as he approached the chain again, he saw that it had not moved. It remained stretched taut toward the water, like a sentence waiting for its final word. Already there were people waiting. A pair of local fishermen stood with their arms crossed, discussing in low voices whether the metal might belong to a sunken cargo ship they had heard old men whisper about years before. Nearby, a group of teenagers lounged in the sand, phones raised to capture every moment. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, reporters had arrived as well, their cameras set up on tripods, their microphones catching the chatter of the crowd and the sound of the surf. Samuel ignored them. He made his way to the chain and bent once more, his hands closing over the rusted links. He tugged with the same steady patience as before, and though the weight resisted, it yielded just enough to send that familiar shudder through the sand. The crowd gasped as if they were a single body, their disbelief and wonder shared between them. He heard voices all around him now, speculating about treasure, about war relics, about cursed ships swallowed by storms. But none of their guesses mattered to him. All that mattered was the feel of the chain in his hands, the sense that he had been chosen to uncover whatever lay hidden. More men joined in, encouraged by the sight of the old fisherman refusing to let go. Some worked beside him in silence. Others called instructions as though they had authority over the task. They brought tools, makeshift hooks, even the winches from their trucks. The beach transformed into a kind of expedition, improvised but determined. Each heave drew more of the chain free, clattering and echoing like a drumbeat that carried far beyond the dunes. As the hours passed, more of the structure revealed itself. The sand sloughed away to expose a section of reinforced metal, unmistakably part of a vessel. The hatch outline grew clearer, its corroded edges etched with patterns of time. And then someone noticed it, a mark, faint but still visible, cut into the steel. At first it looked like nothing more than scratches, but Samuel knew better. He had served long enough to recognize the faded remains of a military insignia. The sight of it sent a chill through him. This was no merchant ship, no forgotten cargo hold. This was something meant to be hidden, and the ocean had hidden it well. The crowd swelled as the day wore on. Entire families arrived with coolers as though attending a festival. Vendors from town appeared, seizing the chance to sell food to the curious. Children played at the edge of the surf, running back toward their parents with shells and bits of kelp, unaware of the tension building among the adults. Every conversation circled back to the same point. What was buried beneath the sand, and why had it chosen now to be found? Samuel watched it all with quiet detachment. He did not crave their attention, nor did he welcome it. The chain was not theirs to claim, not a spectacle to amuse them. It was a summons, and he alone felt its weight. Still, he said nothing. If the sea had called him to this moment, it would reveal its truth in its own time, not through argument or claim. Late in the afternoon, as the sky grew heavy with new clouds, the atmosphere shifted. The air seemed charged, expectant, as though the ocean itself was waiting to see what the intruders would do next. When the chain groaned again under the pull of dozens of hands, the vibration spread beneath their feet, rattling through the sand like the murmur of a giant waking from sleep. A hush fell over the crowd. Even the children stopped to stare. The hatch was almost fully visible now. Barnacles clung stubbornly to its edges, and streaks of rust colored the sand around it. But the structure itself remained intact, sealed against the years. The mark upon it was clearer too, a triangle etched with numbers too faded to read. Some whispered that it belonged to the Navy, others that it was foreign. Samuel's eyes lingered on it, and though he could not name the vessel, he knew with certainty that it had been built for war. Conversations turned heated as speculation ran wild. Reporters shouted questions, townsfolk demanded answers, and arguments broke out about whether it might hold treasure or danger. Yet no one dared to approach too close to the hatch. They circled it like wary pilgrims at the edge of a holy place, afraid and reverent in equal measure. Through it all, Samuel remained still, his weathered face unreadable. He felt the same unease as the rest of them, but deeper than fear was a sense of inevitability. The sea did not return its secrets lightly. Whatever was buried here had not been meant for them, and yet it had surfaced now. He could not help but believe it was part of a design beyond their understanding. When evening settled, painting the horizon with streaks of red and gray, the beach showed no sign of dispersing. Lanterns and floodlights flickered on as the crowd prepared to stay through the night. The hatch gleamed faintly under their artificial glow, an unyielding door that seemed to hold the weight of history itself. The wind carried the scent of salt and iron, sharp in the lungs, and the ocean murmured with a rhythm that sounded almost like speech. Samuel stood apart, watching the waves stretch and fold across the sand. He felt tired, yes, but not defeated. This was not the end, only another step. He knew that the chain had not finished speaking, that the ocean had more to reveal. As the crowd pressed closer and the reporters angled their cameras toward the hatch, Samuel felt a presence in the air, heavy and insistent. It was not triumph he felt, nor relief, but the tightening coil of anticipation. The sea was not done. The chain had only shown them the beginning, and he, more than anyone else, understood that the true weight of its story was still buried in the deep. Evening had settled heavy over Port Ivy, but the beach showed no sign of quieting. Lanterns and floodlights kept the strange discovery illuminated as though it were a stage, and the hatch its central actor, drawing people into its orbit with an unshakable gravity. The chain lay stretched across the sand, like the backbone of some ancient beast, the links glistening with brine under the false light, their shadows deep and menacing against the sand. Children tugged at their parents' hands, begging to be allowed closer, while the adults kept their distance, as though invisible boundaries marked the space around the hatch. The earlier excitement of the crowd had given way to a taut tension, like the held breath before a storm. Samuel Hill stood apart from the throng, leaning against a piece of driftwood lodged deep into the beach. His body ached from the strain of the last 2 days, and his hands were raw where the iron links had bitten into his skin. Yet none of the pain seemed to matter. His eyes remained fixed on the hatch, his mind circling the same questions over and over. Why here? Why now? He could not shake the sense that the ocean had allowed this to surface with purpose, that it had chosen this precise moment in time to return something long lost. And if that were true, then perhaps it had chosen him as well, not just as the one to find it, but as the one who must bear its truth. The crowd stirred as a new presence arrived on the beach. A convoy of dark vehicles pulled up along the dunes, and from them stepped men and women in uniform. The chatter of the onlookers rose to a clamor before ebbing into uneasy silence. The Coast Guard had come, and with them, authority. Floodlights repositioned at their command, barricades set into place, and tape strung up to push the crowd back. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but the officers moved with quiet precision, acknowledging none of it. Among them walked a woman with a posture that brooked no challenge. Her name, murmured quickly through the crowd, was Commander Riley. Riley studied the hatch with a soldier's eye, her expression unreadable, though the sharp set of her jaw revealed her own intrigue. She spoke in low tones to her team, and soon men with scanners and instruments began circling the structure, taking readings, photographing every detail. Samuel watched them work, their careful movements so different from the clumsy eagerness of the townsfolk, and he felt the shift in the air. This was no longer a curiosity. This was an investigation. For the townspeople, the arrival of the Coast Guard brought frustration. They shouted that the discovery belonged to the town, that they had the right to know what lay beneath their beach. Some jeered when officers pushed them further back. Others pressed forward in defiance until forced to retreat. But the truth was clear in their faces, even as they protested. Fear mingled with their anger. They wanted to know, but they also dreaded the answer. The hatch seemed to pulse in the sand like a buried heart, and none of them truly wanted to be the one to open it. Samuel did not protest. He simply remained at the edge of the barricades, his eyes never leaving the hatch. He felt no anger at the uniforms, only a deeper sense of distance, as though with each official step the discovery was slipping further from his hands. Yet he knew something none of them could understand. The chain had called to him alone first. He had been the one to touch it, to hear its groan, to feel the echo of whatever lay buried. No authority could take that away from him. Night thickened around the beach. The reporters packed away their gear but did not leave, huddling near the dunes for any sign of breaking news. The crowd thinned, though many lingered, unwilling to abandon the mystery to the dark. Only the Coast Guard kept steady watch, their lights cutting bright circles into the sand. Samuel drifted among the shadows, restless, the pull of the hatch gnawing at him. He could not leave either. The ocean had brought this secret to the surface, and he knew it had not done so for the sake of governments or officials. It had done so for him. Near midnight, when the beach was quiet but for the hum of generators, Samuel returned to the barricade. He slipped past it unnoticed, his steps sure and steady despite his years. The hatch loomed before him, a dark slab of iron and history, gleaming faintly under the floodlights. He laid his palm against it, just as he had against the chain, and in that instant he felt the faintest tremor pass through the steel. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, the slow thrum of something alive, or once alive, beneath his hand. His breath caught, and for a moment he closed his eyes, letting the vibration pass through him. It was not a sound, not a word, but it was communication nonetheless, and he understood without understanding. The sea was not finished with him. The next morning the town awoke to news that chilled even the most skeptical hearts. The Coast Guard had confirmed what Samuel had already suspected. The hatch belonged to a vessel, not a cargo ship or merchant wreck, but a submarine. Records pulled from old archives suggested it had vanished more than 50 years ago during the height of the Cold War. Its disappearance had been whispered about for decades in military circles, but no trace had ever been found until now. Beneath the sand of Port Ivy lay not a treasure of gold or jewels, but a time capsule of men and steel, sealed by water and silence. The announcement spread like fire. For some it was a moment of pride, their little town suddenly thrust into history. For others it was fear, the realization that something built for war had slept beneath their feet all these years. Reporters poured in from other cities, their voices rising above the surf with excitement, while the townsfolk stood in small, murmuring groups, unsure what to make of it all. Samuel listened without comment, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sea shimmered pale beneath the morning sun. The answers given by the officials were not answers for him. He cared little for the dates or the names or the records. What mattered was the presence, the certainty that the ocean itself had decided to reveal the secret. He alone had been there when the chain first rose from the sand, when the hatch first took its breath of air after decades below. To the world it was a discovery, but to him it was a conversation, one that had begun the moment he touched the cold iron and would not end until he was gone. By afternoon, as more experts arrived to study the submarine, Samuel wandered back to the edge of the beach. The crowd pressed behind barricades now, their questions louder and more desperate, but he barely heard them. His eyes lingered on the chain, coiled in the sand like the severed tether of something vast. He thought of his father's warning, of the silent graveyard where ships disappeared and voices whispered from the deep. And he knew with a clarity that sent a chill through him that the ocean did not give this back out of generosity. It gave it back as a reminder. That evening, as the sun sank and the last light turned the waves to fire, Samuel sat alone on the dunes. The noise of the crowd dimmed behind him, the shouts of reporters faded, and for a long moment there was only the endless roll of the sea. He closed his eyes and let its voice surround him. It spoke in rhythms too vast to understand, but the message was clear enough. History was not buried forever. Secrets did not drown quietly, and those who listened closely enough could hear the truth rise with the tide. When he opened his eyes again, stars had begun to prick the sky. The hatch lay silent under its floodlights, but Samuel knew it was not truly silent. It waited. Perhaps for officials to open it, perhaps for storms to bury it once more. But for him, the message had already been delivered. The chain had called him, and he had answered. The sea's secret was not gold, nor victory, nor even tragedy. It was a reminder that nothing taken is ever truly lost, that silence carries voices if one dares to listen, and that sometimes the ocean, in its own time, chooses a single man to bear witness to the stories it has kept. Samuel Hill had been chosen, and as he gazed out over the restless horizon, he felt no fear. Only a strange and quiet peace, as though the ocean itself had at last acknowledged him as one of its own. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. Check out the other unbelievable stories waiting for you right here and share this video with your friends. Let them experience the mystery too.